I'm Alfred Weber, and I'm the International Director of the Institute for Cooperation in Space, and we're a nonprofit. We have two principal goals. One is to prevent the weaponization of space and to ban weapons and warfare in space. And the other is to promote cooperation with life in the universe. And it's in that connection that I've developed the work in exopolitics now for the last 35 years. In the mid-1970s, I developed a model called the context communication theory of extraterrestrial communication. It was one of the early theories of how extraterrestrial communications are structured, and it looked at UFO encounters, for example, as multi-dimensional communications from one, say, from a universe society, from one civilized society to another, and that they should be seen almost in the context of dreams, as though you have dream interpretation, a dictionary for dream interpretation, so that in dreams house means something and mother means something and all these sort of things. Well, in UFO encounters, similarly, can be seen as multidimensional communications. And so one of the earlier public policy applications of this was that in 1977, I proposed and became director of a proposed extraterrestrial communication study done in conjunction with the Jimmy Carter White House. And Jimmy Carter, of course, had a close encounter with a UFO in the company of 10 members of the Leary, Georgia Lions Club in 1969 while he was running for governor of Georgia. While he was governor of Georgia in 1973, he had filed an official UFO report. It's now on the internet so everybody can see it. And the 1976 US presidential campaign was extraordinary because it was waged between Jimmy Carter, on the one hand, well, you can't say he's a UFO contactee, but he's had a close encounter. And it was waged, the first campaign waged on a platform which included a disclosure plank of sorts. And there was, Jimmy Carter was asked, there was on various occasions, and this is documented in the campaign, a UFO expert in Wisconsin asked him if he, once elected, would he open up the extraterrestrial UFO files, and he said yes, he would. He went from maybe to yes. On the other side, of course, was Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford had been a member of the Warren Commission, one of the architects of the single bullet theory, and through his role in the U.S. House Armed Services Committee subsequent to the 1966 very famous UFO flap in his state of Michigan, the U.S. Armed Services Committee, had taken kind of a national security approach, and not very much information had been forthcoming from that. So you had sort of the two sides really waging a political campaign there. It was a very interesting exopolitical exercise, and Carter won. So following that, I became a futurist at Stanford Research Institute at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and on the explicit agreement that I would go forward to conduct and direct a scientific study of extraterrestrial communication, the first such study ever, with the administration of Jimmy Carter, and I went forward with full project approval of Stanford Research Institute and made inquiries and made contact with the domestic policy staff of the White House, received preliminary approval, drew up documents, brought in a group of high-level scientific advisors, brought in the made contact with the National Science Board. I was then doing contract research with them, and developed a project plan which would have brought this forward. This was in the spring and summer of 1977. And we had received at that point the approval of the White House to go forward on this project. And what Stanford Research Institute does is contract research. I mean, for for funding, we carry this out. So at one stage, I remember I had just met with an Assistant Secretary of Defense of the Carter administration in the Pentagon, in the inner ring of the Pentagon, and we had been discussing their proposals for space platforms and for weapons based on space platforms. And I went back to Palo Alto. I was traveling back and forth. And I was called into the office of the vice president, the administrative vice president of Stanford Research Institute, along with Peter Schwartz, my fellow researcher who had been sort of part of the formulation of this project. He's now founder and chairman of the board, or president of the Global Business Network. And he just completed a study for the Pentagon in March of 2004 on the abrupt climate study. And so he was present there, and the Pentagon liaison, the SRI Pentagon liaison, came in and said this project has to shut down because if it goes forward, we have been told by the Pentagon that Stanford Research Institute will lose all of its contracts with the Department of Defense. At that time, Stanford Research Institute's total budget was about $100 million. This was 1977. It was a fair amount at that point. And I wouldn't be able to estimate at this point, but that was a fairly substantial chunk. They did a lot of contract research in terms of missile strategy, et cetera. So it was a good chunk of money. And the official reason given was that, quote, there are no UFOs, end of quote. And of course, I was here. I had gotten the approval of the White House. I'd gotten the administrative approval of Stanford Research Institute. I had gotten the agreement of high-level scientists, the National Science Board. We would be moving with NASA and other agencies, and it was a very well thought out study in terms of the formulation, and it was shut down. So from that work, I've evolved now this next phase of the work, which is the exopolitics, and I learned a great deal from that experience. A lot of good came out of it, I must say. One of the good things, which I think came out of it, because this was an effort which not only happened in the 1977-78 field, was that in 1978 as well, the United Nations General Assembly approved a resolution calling on world governments to conduct research into extraterrestrial life and recommending the establishment of a United Nations department to study and to be concerned with extraterrestrial affairs. So building on that, we've now developed the exopolitics model. And what the exopolitics model is basically, if you look at the 20th century, model. The 20th century worldview, roughly speaking, is that the scientific paradigm is that all intelligent life ends at the geostationary orbit. The geostationary orbit is 22,242 miles up. It's that point where a satellite is stationary over a single point rather than circling the Earth, but it's at a stationary fixed point. And what that says is that, oh yes, we humans are the only intelligent civilization in this vast, vast universe. Well, the exopolitics model, which is a paradigm for the 21st century, is sort of the flip side of that. And what that says is that no, the universe is actually highly populated with intelligent civilizations that are in the process of evolution, you know, and of many different sorts, and they operate under universal law. They're subject to universal governance, and their actions are mediated by the process of universe of universe politics. That's a model that we can understand because our terrestrial governance structure is actually modeled on what the universe governance structure is. We're an entry-level planet. We've reached that phase of development as a populated planet where we can be integrated, some would say reintegrated, because we've been quarantined. Once we get deeply into it, we've been quarantined. It's time now that we can come back into universe society. Now, you might say, well, how do we know this? This is a model. It's kind of like when Niels Bohr said, oh, I had a dream and this is what the atom looks like. How do we know this? We have various databases and kind of searchlight, which is based on the scientific method. And the essence of the scientific method is replicability. That is, you can use a methodology which gives you replicable results, and that's what the scientific methodology, kind of the basics of it. One new sort of searchlight technique, scientifically based, was coincidentally developed by Ingo Swann and by Dr. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ while I was at the Stanford Research Institute campus, and that was remote viewing. And what remote viewing very consists of is using very rigorous protocols with highly trained individuals. The consciousness of that individuals goes into what they call subspace, that is, as much as possible outside of the time-space context. If we know that the time and space is a continuum, so that in the same way that we can go to any location in space physically, well, if by dropping outside into a subspace in the time-space continuum, the mind of the trained remote viewer, following these protocols, and why we say following these protocols is because the remote viewer can then replicate the results accurately, and that is why we know that it's verifiable information. It's scientifically derived information because it meets all of the tests of scientifically derived information. And the early experiments, which were developed at SRI and elsewhere, which were funded by the defense agencies, use them mainly for military intelligence purposes. Tell me what the files are in KGB officer in Leningrad and what's there, or over here, or ICBM troop movements, et cetera, and if you go into the project files, or if you go into the published literature, you will see that the degree of accuracy is extraordinary, and it's replicable. They can go again and again and again, and you'll get replicable results. Well, this is a tool. This is one of the prime exopolitical tools, and this is a scientific breakthrough that allows us to map the nature of universe society. And some of the most significant breakthroughs happened in the 1990s through the discipline, through an evolution of remote viewing called scientific remote viewing, in which scientists such as Dr. Courtney Brown, who's at Emory University, would take the remote viewing and apply it to remote viewing communications with the consciousness of entities located in civilizations on other celestial bodies, in other planetary systems, etc. So in that way, we would be able to develop replicable communications in what they call subspace, with civilizations in other planets, and not only that, with representatives of universe governance bodies. So, as it turns out, scientific remote viewing is where we've been able, through this replicable scientific methodology, to achieve interactive communication, not only with representative of off-planet cultures, but with representatives of universe governance bodies, and learn more about the structure of universe society. Let's say if we look at, let's kind of step back and look at the big picture. If we look at a big picture, from a big picture point of view, the UFO phenomenon as we know it, say starting in 1947, may have been a multidimensional communication outreach of a mixed nature. Some of the UFOs may be terrestrial, some may be off-planet cultures, but they are more of a communication outreach. Kind of, if we look at it, there's a scientific principle called peripheral cueing. And in peripheral cueing, it's a way of taking the mass attention. You know how when you see the end, oh, I don't know quite what it is, but it's making me aware. And the UFO phenomenon itself sort of is a way to make humanity aware that it's not alone in the universe, or there's something amorphous that's out there. So it's this initial communication outreach that is known colloquially as the UFO phenomenon. But it's really a multidimensional communication outreach in information terms. So that would be phase one. Now, the question is communication outreach from what or whom and for what purpose? This is where exopolitics comes in, because one can then devise a model of who's out there, what's out there, and what's the goal and purpose of the communication, and is it, and what could be the next stages. And so scientific remote viewing has come along at a very opportune time because it's filled in a picture of what's out there and how universe society might be structured. Based on that, we can develop an approach to say, okay, what seems to make sense from here? How can we develop an interactive framework as a society, as an individual society, as individuals, as a culture, to interact with and co-create a future with an apparent intelligent civilization that it wants to interact with us. And from there comes several proposals that we put forth in exopolitics. One of the proposals is what we call a decade of contact. And a decade of contact is a 10-year period, say, where we would say, let's just openly acknowledge that we live in a populated universe. Let's take the whole extraterrestrial UFO question out of the military industrial agencies and put it in the Department of Education where it belongs. And have a 10-year period of publicly funded education, scientific research, curricula development. I mean, your kindergarten kids should, grow up knowing that we live in a populated universe. Textbooks have to be developed for primary education, secondary education, your college textbook. It's going to take quite a cultural change once we have that open acknowledgement. And that opening process itself is going to open to the infrastructure process of integration. Think how much work there is, say, in having just individual human societies come together. All of the work that goes into the preparation of delegations, the preparation of treaties, the preparation of relations, the preparation of immigration. And here we are on the surface culture. We have been under a mutual embargo. One of the great papers by Dr. Hal Puthoff and others, which recently came out, is they call it the leaky embargo theory, that UFOs are leaks, deliberate leaks in an embargo by universe society. They don't want to overwhelm us with the information, so they're coming with leaks. Well, and likewise, there are certain governmental agencies, governments on the planet, not all governments, just certain governments, that have been trying to pull the wool over the eyes of their citizens and the citizens of the world to try to keep power, stay in the 19th and 20th centuries. Well, so humans, our normal human society has been under an embargo from both sides, so that the process of now developing all of the normal legal and social and governmental infrastructure for the normalization of relations. So the second thing that we propose is what we call a Star Dreams initiative. Instead of Star Wars, this is Star Dreams. And it's a Star Dreams initiative for public interest diplomacy with off-planet cultures. And we at the Institute for Cooperation in Space many of us come out of the movement in the 1980s during the glasnost period with perestroika, where we had public interest diplomacy between, and non-governmental organizations and groups and individuals who deconstructed, quote, the Iron Curtain, and sort of brought about the end of that period of a Cold War or the permanent warfare economy, or tried to. And we jumped over the Iron Curtain and we established citizen-to-citizen communication. Now there's some problems with it still, but at least we went forward there. And so the analog would be that, with the off-planet cultures, spiritually advanced off-planet cultures now visiting Earth. Now, it turns out that from the existing scientific remote viewing evidence, universe governance bodies, there are universe governance bodies that have authorized planetary relations between Earth and other neighboring planets, other inhabited neighboring planets. Apparently, there is governance out there, and you can't these things are kind of regulated because there's larger factors involved, and some of the scientific remote viewing information, which still has to be verified, indicates that there is a civilization that's about 150 years technologically in advance of ours, for which contact has been authorized. Well, more than contact, sort of the resumption of planetary relations. So the Star Dreams initiative could, through public interest diplomacy, using these tools like scientific remote viewing, begin to develop all of the infrastructure and initiatives while we're having this new 10-year period of openly acknowledged relations. Now, that implies a sea change in consciousness. Well, part of the conditions of the sea change are already there, because if you look at the public opinion polls, depending on how the question's asked, between 65 and 85% of the respondents, say yes, we're in a populated universe, or yes, extraterrestrials are visiting Earth. So it's a very, the great predominance of public opinion believes that we are in a populated universe. So that is our current stance. Now, one specific application that we've done is in Canada, which has always been a nation at the forefront, of exopolitics. And in fact, in 1967, the then Minister of Defense of Canada under Lester Pearson, his name was Paul Hellyer, very well regarded Minister of Defense, and of course Lester Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize. He came up with a concept for the Blue Berets and the whole UN peacekeeping operation. Well, Paul Hellyer, as Minister of Defense of Canada, on June 3rd, 1967, flew to St. Paul, Alberta, and inaugurated the world's first official extraterrestrial landing pad, and dedicated it to galactic peace. So that was a huge symbolic step. And he later on became the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada under Pierre Trudeau, and has been the longest serving member of parliament in the history of Canada, Paul Hellyer. And so you can see how Canada has had this tradition. So what we were able to do as the Institute for Cooperation in Space was this year on March 10th, 2005, we tabled a presentation to the Canadian Senate. The Canadian Senate, the way that the Senate currently operates in Canada is it's an appointed body for longer terms, so the senators can take a really long-term point of view, and they generally take progressive positions on issues. And so we tabled and made a presentation to them for a Canadian exopolitics initiative by which the Canadian government, acting under the general aegis or umbrella of the 1978 United Nations General Assembly resolution calling on member governments, national governments, to further their research on extraterrestrial life, would undertake an exopolitics initiative which would undertake several things. Number one, it would take the primary responsibility for extraterrestrial affairs out of the military industrial, out of the CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. It's like the CIA of Canada, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is like the FBI of Canada. Take it out of there and put it into the Ministry of Education and into scientific ministries, and all of this under a general rubric of what we call the Decade of Contact. And that is an open acknowledgement that by the Government of Canada that we live in a populated universe and that we need a 10-year period of publicly funded, this is to be federally funded in Canada, and however the provinces would like and the cities would like once everybody gets in on this new perspective, programs of education, curriculum development, textbook development, scientific. I mean, this is an entire industry. This is, turning a society inside out. But think of the prosperity that you're bringing. This is a whole new industry. You're putting so many PhDs to work. You're putting so many, school children that'll be excited. You're putting all of the educational and technological resources of the society now have been opened up to this brand new vista. And because it's from an educational standpoint. Because one of the things that Paul Hellyer, as Minister of Defense of Canada, realized in inaugurating the world's first extraterrestrial landing pad in 1967 was that extraterrestrials are not a national security issue. They're an educational and social issue for our society. And they may be a spiritual issue because of there's the whole issue of evolution of consciousness and higher spiritual values, and as our society evolves, we evolve toward more ethical positions and toward I hesitate to use words like source or divine or God, but because they have certain connotations that may take it in one direction or the other. But this is an era in which science and spirituality really kind of come together, and through the scientific remote viewing, transcripts with representatives of off-planet cultures and with representatives of universe governance bodies, they indicate that yes, the universe is that along with technological evolution comes what we would call spiritual evolution. That science can demonstrate that there are many parts to the human body. There's this kind of thing that we call the physical body. It's like our costume. But then there are other parts to it. There are these electromagnetic kind of, components that people call auras or whatever, in which there is information and consciousness. And there is even a component that survives bodily death, that one Swedish scientist purportedly has weighed, and it weighs 21 grams. But purportedly, okay, and I've looked at the papers. And that all of these things that come out of the world's various religions, as it turns out, our science and our religions, if we go way back, that sort of religion was the first repository of our science, and that the kind of spiritual models of the universe and religious models of the universe all bear some truth. So the decade of contact would be to really discover our place in the universe, to discover not only our future, but to discover our past. Why are we an isolated planet? What did occur? And some of the information in the scientific remote viewing has suggested that the information in some of our sacred texts, like the book of Genesis story of the Garden of Eden, would be an allegorical form of that there's some historical basis to that there may have been beings, that the Adam and Eve story may be a metaphor for a real historical events that took place in the far distant past. All of this has to be examined, and all of it will ultimately may well be a vindication of the spiritual point of view of the universe. So those are the possibilities that lie within exopolitics. But the initial steps are quite practical, and we have developed them into platforms that institutions like the Canadian Senate can really understand. Institutions that, like the United Nations, whose General Assembly has already approved this in principle, can understand. And institutions and into platforms that say candidates for political office. For example, let's take, we're now in 2005. Well, 2008, there's a US presidential election. And there has not been a candidate for a US presidential election that has run on an explicit exopolitical platform since Jimmy Carter in the 1976 campaign. Well, we know for certain, because it's been released through Freedom of Information in documents and through the Congressional Research Service, that during the Clinton administration, both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton met with Lawrence Rockefeller, and were both extremely interested in the extraterrestrial and UFO issue, for which they're to be commended. And this is genuine statesmanship. Well, if Mrs. Clinton decides to run for president in 2008, why should she not run on an exopolitical platform? Jimmy Carter did that successfully in 2008. In fact, why should not all candidates be required to? Within a larger context, you might say, well, why did universe society start after World War II? Why did they? What was the timing? What was the timing of this. And there may be a real functional reason why universe society has been signaling us through things like the UFO phenomenon, why we've been acquiring the ability to communicate through scientific remote viewing, why we've been developing models like exopolitics so that we can understand as a society how to integrate. And that may relate to vast changes in our ecology and our Earth system. Sure, we're in danger of what I call the A future, the Armageddon future, which is the world blows itself up, ends up in fire. We have worldwide global nuclear war if the missile defense system goes forward and weapons in space. There are many researchers that said that that's inherently unstable and we're going to end up in that. There's another future which is global warming. We're now 2.5, we're the highest global temperatures in 3.5 million years. I've spoken to leading world atmospheric scientists that say, quote, humanity and human civilization may be extinct as we know it by the end of this century because of the effects of global warming. So these are real challenges. There may even be a greater challenge that we've just found out about as of the end of 2004 and with the release of the data in February of 2005, and that is the galactic superwave. And what occurs, just very, very simply, it very well may be that the Asian tsunami, which occurred on December 26, 2004, may have somehow been triggered by the explosion of a neutron star in the constellation Sagittarius about 45 million light years ago, because the gamma ray burst from that hit Earth on December, right at that time, on December 27th, 2005. And what occurs is that those type of events typically accompany the beginning of a galactic superwave. If you look at our galaxy, it's very unstable. Our galaxy is actually like a big volcano, boom, and it'll have these sort of eruptions from the middle, which manifest as waves of energy, and they go out on a periodic basis according to scientists like Paul Laviolette, Dr. Paul Laviolette, every 13 to 26,000 years. And the next cycle of the galactic superwave is in 2012. The sort of around the December, December 21st, 2012, is scientifically correlated to this galactic superwave, which may have already caused the tsunami and may be causing all of this new energy is now causing all of these earth changes. It's causing all of the violence because our brain waves are electromagnetic. So as this superwave comes in, which is nothing but a wave of energy, our systems are becoming upset, so that the signal of the UFO phenomenon from a kind of a larger perspective may be universe society saying, gee, you've got about 50 years to prepare for the galactic superwave, and it's coming. And our response cannot be to have buried our head in the sand, as the military-industrial complex, as the permanent warfare economy on Earth seems to have done. So it's clear that we need an open solution, an exopolitical solution, with an open decade of contact, with open, transparent diplomacy. How this is going to play, we're just going to have to follow it through. We've tabled our proposal with the Canadian Senate. We're going to be announcing it here in the United States, at the National Press Club and at other forums. We're going to be announcing it in Europe and in other places. And gradually going to the United Nations, going to all candidates in as many countries as we can, and taking it forward with as much practical, feet on the ground proposals as we can that governments can understand, that people can understand, and hopefully that then society can open up to a positive interactive process. We are on a planet, a life-bearing planet, and there seems to be other systems, similar systems of life-bearing planets out there. But that's just one level of the ecology of dimensions. And it appears that in this model, which is tending to be supported, being cumulatively supported by more and more evidence, such as the evidence that you mentioned of infrared light put on certain photographs, which will reveal ships there, and that there are dimensions where what those places where our deeper consciousness comes from before death and goes to after death may be part of a single ecology of dimensions, which includes where the consciousnesses of other civilizations on other planets throughout the universe go to and come through, such that there is an interactivity in the universe. The afterlife and dimensions out there in the universe may be very, very similar, or the before life may be very, very similar. And we're just at the beginnings of starting to understand this. And this is part of the overall rubric of when they say that spirituality and science will come together. Our governments have placed the ET UFO issue inside the military-industrial complex as though it's a threat, whereas in reality it may be a deep spiritual issue. And therefore, outcomes such as the US Pentagon allegedly going to DEFCON 3 if they did so, a very high level of threat, during the Phoenix Lights. That's what happens when one approaches a highly evolved phenomenon from a threat point of view. You perceive it as a threat. Whereas the lights viewed by many of the other residents of Phoenix brought them into levels of higher awareness because they did not view it as a threat, but as an evolutionary connection point. And so that says that a better strategy for our society would be to take relations with extraterrestrials outside of the military intelligence threat scenario and place it in the Department of Education and scientific research scenario. And that's what we were trying to do in the Jimmy Carter study, but perhaps it was too early. But that's what we have to do now because there is very little time left. Part of the embargo that was placed on the human race over the last 50, well, say since World War II, objectively. So we're now, what, 60 years into it, was not only a model, what I would call the 20th century paradigm, which we talked about. All intelligent life ends at the geostationary orbit, and if you think otherwise, you're going to be ridiculed, and you will lose your academic position, and you will lose all prestige in the academic area, and academia is riddled with gatekeepers. In other words, individuals, kind of the thought police. You don't say that politely in academia, but they are thought police. And I'll give you an example. Our director of New Energy, Dr. Brian O'Leary, who trained as an astronaut to go to Mars. And he was an astronomer on the faculty of Cornell University with Carl Sagan. And Dr. Brian O'Leary took the position that extraterrestrials and UFOs were real. And Carl Sagan took the position that they weren't. Well, Carl Sagan prospered and put forth a misleading position. In other words, he poo-pooed extraterrestrials, and he founded the SETI program, which this year is being shown in papers is scientifically flawed. It may have gotten a lot of funding, but it's scientifically flawed. On the other hand, Dr. Brian O'Leary said publicly, and I talked with him on this issue. He said publicly at a conference, the New Energy Conference, which was held in 2004, that was the first time in 30 years that he had been on a university campus. So he was blackballed from the university campuses. He was a colleague of Carl Sagan's on the astronomy department. Carl Sagan was honored. Brian O'Leary was blackballed for 30 years because he said that UFOs were real. Now we come down 30 to 40 years down the road, and it's 2005. 50 years have passed. We're at the 11th hour. We're very near 2012. There's a lot of environmental stress that's coming in. We don't know if it's too little, too late that we can do now. If we had had open relations with the Universe Society from the time that they initiated an open initiative, our society may have been far different. I think it's great that individual minds are beginning to come. I'm hoping that the exopolitics model will be the bridging model that structurally bridges into the canon of academia. Because what's important is the structural blinders and the structural belief patterns and the structural paradigm. If the exopolitics model can come in and establish itself as the dominant paradigm, such that structurally within academia, the earth is no longer flat, it is now round. The universe, intelligent life no longer ends at the geostationary orbit. The universe is now highly populated. It's that sort of sea change that we need to unleash the huge public investment and private explosion of creativity and cooperation to turn our spaceship around to be able to survive the environmental pressures that are coming now, which have been the result of the embargo that we've been under. What I'm saying is that individuals are coming is great, but we're at a stage now where we need a structural change, a structural opening up in academia, in government, in science, in funding, in the religions, in all of it. We need a sea change. I'm not an expert on this, but what I believe, this is why I believe we need the decade of contact, because we're at an extreme state of ignorance, and we don't know. We don't know what the true situation is. So what I would say is that we don't know what abductions are, and we don't know their purpose, and what we need is an open scientific investigation and knowledge of what they're about. Now, having said that, my reading, or one reading of the best estimate on what abductions are or may be, is as follows. And I derive this from the Scientific Remote Viewing database. Not so much from the Human Abductee Report database. One section of the abductee reports may be what we call MILABs, military abductions. And these are false abductions by black budget outfits, paramilitary outfits, whose purpose is part of the information war to demonize the extraterrestrial initiative. And there's documentation of this. So those experiences are extremely traumatic. Now, let me shift over to the other area of abductions. And I'm not an abductions expert, but I study them insofar as of their exopolitical context. From the scientific remote viewing perspective, that is, looking at the abductions, or a certain category of abductions which have occurred, from certain remote viewing transcripts, the following is the explanation given by those transcripts. This has not been verified, but I will state what it is, and that is, according to those transcripts, there's a certain race of extraterrestrials which is deployed around our planet, which is highly evolved, called the evolved greys. There are three different categories of greys. And the evolved greys are used in planetary emergencies. They're about 1 million years more evolved than we are. And they have their own history. And according to these transcripts, in a series of operations that have been authorized by galactic governance authorities, they engaged in gathering and have gathered a genetic and DNA bank of the entire DNA profile of this planet. And the reason is that we may be going into a very deep ecological catastrophe, which has been exacerbated by our own human warfare and fossil fuel economy and nuclear economy. It may be that this is all speculative, it may be that our planet will be impacted in a great way, in a detrimental way. And the Greys were authorized to, sort of like a Noah's Ark, to develop a full genetic and DNA bank of all flora and fauna on this planet so as to replant it centuries down the road after the catastrophe. That's one story. Apparently, the larger context is that we're upgraded all the time. And that what we call abductions, or certain categories of abductions, took place as a result of an authorized genetic upgrade of the human race, trying to get us out of our warlike ways and ecologically ecocidal ways. I mean, we have to be realistic about what we're doing to this planet as an ecocidal and omnicidal race. Granted, we don't participate in these terrible acts of the permanent warfare state at all. And I believe, and I commend, to everyone, that exopolitics offers a bridge out of the permanent warfare industry into transforming the permanent warfare industry into a cooperative, peaceful, space-age society integrating with universe society. Scientific remote viewing is a methodology which provides replicable data for communications and interaction with, in a subspace out of time and space, with other civilizations on life-bearing planets and with universe governance authorities. And one of the policy recommendations that we have is for the initiation of public interest diplomacy with spiritually advanced off-planet cultures. And that what certain scientific remote viewing data have revealed is that there is a planetary civilization which is about 150 years technologically in advance of ours, with which the universe authorities have authorized our initiation of planetary relations with them. So that if we wish to go forward as part of this decade of open contact and education, we can initiate as part of that, in this context, the initiation of planetary relations with another planetary civilization. One of the reasons why they've authorized it is because they are not that far advanced of us, but just enough far advanced of us that there could be benefits. The benefits would be is that civilization does not war amongst itself. At any point in time, we have about 150 wars going on this planet because we're organized in a permanent warfare economy. That civilization is not. So they could benefit us. They've also evolved beyond the fossil fuel civilization, so they can benefit us with regard to new ecological forms of energy. Conversely, where we can benefit them is that we live on a paradise on Earth. They live on a planet that was hit by an ecological catastrophe and live underground. What has been replicated and established is that there is an apparent intelligent civilization on our neighboring planet of Mars. And this is where it gets a bit complicated, but I'll try and explain it very simply, because it's kind of like a science fiction movie, and we've all been prepared for this, for science fiction movie, through the concept of time travel. We've all been to time travel movies, okay? And this again goes to the issue of the high grays. The highly evolved grays that are about 1 million years in evolved to us are used as emergency evac. They're like the Red Cross of the universe when they're planetary emergencies. And it appears as though sometime in the distant past, okay, we're talking 1 million, 2 million, don't know exactly, Mars suffered an ecological catastrophe. Not of their own making. It may have been a galactic superwave. It may have been for other reasons. I've seen different versions of it. Okay? Some of it may relate to why we are quarantined as a planet now. This is part of why we need this decade of contact. But they suffered an ecological catastrophe, and their surface civilization, their atmosphere, their rivers, their everything, their surface was just destroyed. And there was a real emergency. The advanced grays, according to this scientific remote viewing information, were called in, and they have the ability to travel in time, because in some sense, all space travel can be time travel, because when you're 50 million light years away, you want to be able to get there in an instant. So it's time travel in a certain way when you go through the wormholes. So advanced civilizations have mastered that, had mastered time-space. Time-space is a continuum, so if you can go from ABCD to EFYG in time-space, more advanced than us. So what occurred, according to this version, is that the advanced grays rescued the Martian civilization and brought them forward in time about 1.5 million to 2 million years, and brought them forward in time to our present time, and they are about 150 years in advance of us technologically, but they were just brought forward in time a few million years. Okay, I don't know if I've explained it, but that's it is, because the Martian catastrophe happened back then, and they're living under the surface of Mars, and it's very hard there. And they're technologically advanced, and they don't war amongst themselves, and their main defense is secrecy. And according to this version, the universe authorities would like to and believe that it would be great to promote planetary relations between Earth and Mars, because the Martians would like to come to Earth. They already have advanced scouting parties here, according to this version, in South America, because they kind of look like South American Indians. But to have emigration of Martians to Earth, because it's really hard to live underground for them there. And at the same time, our Earth would benefit, because we'd sort of get out of ourselves and our constant planetary civil wars, warring against ourselves, our permanent warfare state. Think of the humanitarian thing of Earth saving Mars and the Martians, and they're coming here. Many of the flying saucers that we see are Martians. And they're coming here, and kind of us welcoming them. Well, the governmental infrastructure and the treaties and all of that have to be done are our public interest diplomatic outreach. And the Decade of Contact is our finding out all about this. And that's the contact that, according to this view, has been authorized. Now, must stress that this has not been verified, and it's just a case study. It's like, well, hey, if this is true, then it's pretty wise, you know, to really, it's sort of a way out of our dilemma as a planet where we're like a very disturbed autistic child that is constantly beating itself up, or a dysfunctional family, whatever sort of metaphor one wants to use. And that's the essence of one case study of the Star Dreams Initiative, which comes out of the replicable experiments, data experiments of scientific remote viewing within a framework of exopolitics. As more and more information come about, is developed of our solar system celestial bodies, be that Mars, be that Europa, be that Titan, you know, the various moons. It appears as though these planets may have been very Earth-like, and that there may have been a solar system catastrophe. There is a consistency of some solar system catastrophic event which may have been coexistent or coterminous, because, gee, they look like rivers, they look like oceans, they look like bays, and I have even seen photographs, again, of the speculative nature, which say, oh, this is where the ships come out. But again, this is why we need a full-fledged sea change of our civilization, so that all of our resources are devoted openly toward establishing this, rather than having the governmental authorities trying to squelch this, and a culture trying to ridicule it. And all of that is an artifact of disinformation programs deliberately put in by terrestrial authorities in the 1940s and 50s. I just attended a presentation by an expert who presented the state of one version of the state of what is known about underground bases, including underground UFO bases, which may not at all be extraterrestrial. There may be whole underground bases of flying saucers, which are terrestrial craft. It's just an advanced, exotic military craft. Now, the whole issue of underground cities is a very crucial one, because if it's correct that we are now entering a period of extreme environmental stress, which the data are beginning to indicate, and by the data I mean events, specific events like the Asian tsunami, specific events like the behavior of the sun, specific events like the incidence of atmospheric and geological change, specific events like the possibility of the start of a galactic superwave, that is, a wave of energy that occurs after what we could call galactic earthquakes emanating from the galactic center. The galactic center in the Mayan tradition was called Hunan Kub, and one period of organic period of galactic time under the Mayan calendar ends on December 21st, 2012, and a new period of time and starts at that time. These are long periods of time, and what characterizes the Mayan calendar is that it's a galactic calendar, not a solar calendar. It's based on the rotation of the galaxy. Now, in the Mayan tradition, what characterizes those peak periods, like at the 2012, when one tune and another tune starts, are two things. One is Earth changes, and the other is elevation of consciousness. Both of those would occur if a galactic superwave, which is this sort of highly refined energy, is coming from the galactic center. We're talking about electromagnetic events, nothing super esoteric, but that electric energy could stress our planet. Is, in fact, the surface of the planet is a series of 20 or so inverted tectonic plates. It's a highly dynamic system. It's held together by a magnetosphere, by the force of gravity. So if you have all this electromagnetism coming in, you're going to have a lot of seismicity and seismic events. The atmosphere is all part of that ecology. It's dependent on the electromagnetism. Again, you're going to have a lot of that. Our consciousness, our brain operates on electromagnetism. So all of that will be coming over the next few years. If in fact the, quote, governmental authorities of the permanent warfare state have taken this information, and by the experts that I have seen and heard, based on released classified information from the Kennedy administration, including memoranda signed by Walt W. Rostow, in January of 1964, under one of his first acts in the administration of Lyndon Johnson, building underground, classified underground facilities that have recently been declassified. So this is all established. It's not like lore, urban lore. And all of this was initially done by the importation of the experts from Nazi Germany, who were expert in the building of underground facilities. And all through Operation Paperclip, we've just seen the declassified secret army memoranda dated 1946, which showed the personnel that were experts in deep city and deep underground plant construction that were brought over as part of Operation Paperclip from Nazi Germany. So all of these underground cities were initially built, and underground facilities were initially built, but with the technological help of the experts from Nazi Germany and the Third Reich. So if that underground culture now exists, it may have been built because of some knowledge that there will be a period of extreme environmental stress. So that as part of the exopolitical initiative in open relations, we would want a transparency and declassification of this alternative culture, because it's delegitimate, it's unconstitutional, it does not conform to the constitutional acts and the organic constitutions of any of the nation states and of the international order for which it was built. And now there's ample evidence of it in terms of declassified documents, and now we know why they're building it. Plausibly, it's because they're copying what other races have done on other planets, and they're going underground if we're going into a period of stress. So these are some of the fundamental issues, and I'm very glad that we're able to reach these topics, which may sound quite sensational, but they're all based on documentation. That's the problem. So we have to face them through rational public policy and through a framework which says, yes, we're part of a populated universe, and this is how we, planet Earth, who have been under an embargo of Universe Society for a long time, and under a terrestrial embargo for at least 60 years for World War II, because some narrow power elite has chosen to keep itself in power by using this information and technology for its own purposes. We need now to open it up. And believe me, opening this up will unleash an era of creativity such as the Earth has never known. The answers may be surprising, but they're not all that surprising. If you do a structural analysis of the military-industrial complex as it exists, because it's come down to a few very significant acts. And I would like to put on the table a recent book by a professor of theology of 30 years at Claremont, California School of Theology, David Ray Griffin, who has written a book called The New Pearl Harbor, an investigation into the events of September 11th. And what that theologian has produced in that book, which I commend to every member of the audience, and which recently the mainstream media in the United States has broken its self-imposed embargo by broadcasting a talk at the University of Wisconsin by Professor Griffin, and that's C-SPAN, the public affairs, cable public affairs television broadcast. And what is demonstrated, it's like going to the top of the pyramid. If we envision the permanent warfare state or the permanent economy as this vast pyramid, well, who's at the apex? And of responsibility. And what was demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt, such that you would find culpability in a court of the crime of high treason, would be that the events of September 11th was actually a military, strategic deception operation of the government of the United States, carried out by elements of the Department of Defense of the United States under the direct orders of President George W. Bush, Vice President Richard Cheney. I was on the Yale campus with both of them. Dick Cheney washed out of my class at Yale. George W. Bush was a fraternity drunkard at Yale at the same time as me. So I have no compunctions about that. John Ashcroft was in my class at Yale. I think these are people beneath contempt from a moral point of view. So, the mastermind, the technological mastermind, is Donald Rumsfeld. Cheney and Bush signed off on it, and the implementation guys with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. From there, you probably have, you know, the Condoleezza Rices, the Wolfowitzes, and then the whole panoply of people. Well, I was just following orders. But if you want to get to an event which defines the arrogance of that permanent warfare state, and apparently, which is demonstrated in Professor Griffin's book, the original plan from which we were saved because the flight from Boston took off 40 minutes late, it was planned that the Capitol and the White House were also going to be hit, so that you would have a hit of the World Trade Center, the Capitol, thereby killing a lot of the Congress people, the White House. Of course, Condoleezza Rice and Cheney were deep down in the shelter, were going to be hit. And from that, they would launch an invasion of the world. Well, they couldn't quite get that whole thing off the ground. So those are 4 names. Now, I give you the legal precedent of the Nuremberg trials, and yeah, let's go after the architects of this, and we'll get to and liberate all of those operational spaces such as the underground cities. Our intention is not to put the military-industrial complex or the permanent warfare economy on trial. That may end up with a scorched planet. I think that probably one of the wisest statesmen in modern times was Nelson Mandela, who in South Africa instituted the reconciliation process. And it may be that the crimes on this planet, which may be multi-dimensional and multi-species, I mean, there are multi-species on this planet, so there may be multi-species trials. Our goal is to come into a new era of relations with universe society, so that our immediate goal is an educational goal, that is to bring about a transformational goal, to transform what is now a society that's in the dark because of embargoes into a situation of opening, enlightenment, and education, and research, and communication. And that's what we're putting the emphasis on. It may be that there are significant decision makers like Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Rice, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that would stand under war crimes. And as we go into this long decade long of contact and the 20-year process out of that, it may be that we'll enter into processes on this planet with all of the people who worked for the military-industrial complex throughout the world. You know, what were they doing in their compartmentalizations? They were functionally committing ecocide, genocide, planetocide. They were committing the most fundamental atrocities against our rights as galactic citizens. But we have to take a balanced point of view. And we can't destroy the baby with the bathwater. We can't destroy our planet in a civil war for some sense of justice. It may be that the functional analog, and I was privileged to be with the Dalai Lama and with Archbishop Tutu of South Africa in Vancouver when the Dalai Lama came. And the Dalai Lama is establishing his center, the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Reconciliation in Vancouver, because he says that it's the city, this is Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, it's the city that most understands the process of reconciliation. And listening to those two beings, those two blessed gentlemen talk, that you could see that South Africa, after all those years of apartheid, could have gone into a brutal, bloody process of genocide. And yet they brought it into a process of the process of reconciliation. And yet, you know, members of the police and all, yes, they did have to come up and say, yes, I did that. And it was good for everybody. that process, and maybe there's some monetary compensation, you know, but we do it in a, the important thing is to transform into an open, universe-centered society. I'm a futurist. What I know as a scientific fact is that there's no single determined future, but rather we have alternative futures that we can create depending on where we put the energy. Remote viewing data has picked up one alternative future in which the environmental catastrophe is such that humanity can't avoid it. Our surface civilization is destroyed. Humanity goes underground for a period of 300 to 500 years. The environment reemerges, and we emerge a wiser civilization at the other end, a much smaller civilization. That's one possible future. Whether or not that's going to be the case, I don't know. There's a larger picture. It's going to depend on what happens here on the surface from now on. Whether we have a worldwide oppressive society which continues the embargo and people just give up, and then we have the galactic superwave that comes along and says, out with you humans. And we relive that drama over and over and over again. That's one scenario. But we have the tools and the scenario now to take back the power. And there are lawsuits that have been launched against these government officials for high crimes and for treason and high crimes and misdemeanors. And we have an exopolitical platform. And we have the incredible resources of universe society that are on our side. So I think it's time that we take responsibility here and we start moving and we get out of apathy and into really understanding our power. We don't know yet. The future has not been written yet. We don't know yet. But that's why we have to get into creating a positive future now. It's a very, and so is this new thought? Yes, it's new thought. Is that a bad thing? No. It's a good thing to get into a sound, new framework. And so I commend the exopolitical framework.